Hello, time for the press preview then. It's our first look at what is on tomorrow's front pages and having a look at the headlines with us tonight. Contributing editor at Novara Media, Moya Lothian-McLean, and the chief executive at the Total Politics Group, Mark Wallace. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. A very good evening to both of you. We'll chat in a moment after we've had a look at those front pages, beginning with the Eye, which leads on the Privileges Committee report into Boris Johnson, saying he lied and lied and lied. Meanwhile, the Metro asks if his alleged lies to Parliament are career-ending. The FT says he's been condemned in a damning report, while The Guardian focuses on that 90-day suspension the committee recommended for Boris Johnson had he still been a Member of Parliament. Here's the Daily Mail. It says Tory MPs and grassroots activists have been left furious by the Partygate report. The Telegraph also focuses on the response of Boris Johnson's allies' response to the report, saying they will oust the MPs who vote for his censure. The Daily Express describes the committee's findings as the most spiteful stitch-up in the history of politics. And no holds barred from the Daily Star, which depicts Boris Johnson as Pinocchio. And don't forget, you can scan that QR code that you see on screen during the programme, and you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's papers while you watch us discussing them. And tonight, we're joined by Moya Lothian-McLean and Mark Wallace. Great to see you both on this rather warm and humid evening. And it's interesting looking at the front pages because they are very split. We've got the Mail saying it's vindictive, while the Eye says he lied and lied and lied. Mark, we knew this report would be damning, but it was scathing, wasn't it?
Absolutely, very much so. I've got to say, Jonathan, somehow every time we review the papers together, something massive seems to happen. You know, to have a quiet night of news. Yes, the report was absolutely scathing. It didn't pull any punches, and a lot of the evidence that went with it, including from unnamed special advisors, other people around Downing Street, added yet more quite shocking detail that, frankly, I don't think tomorrow's newspapers are going to have quite enough space to go through and pick over all the details from it. We'll see several more days of fallout from the report alone. Clearly, the MPs on that committee, I think, were not calmed in their response by the way Boris Johnson had conducted himself with regard to the inquiry. And we're hearing a lot of, bile and fury from the former Prime Minister and from his most enthusiastic and devoted supporters. But ultimately, it comes down, when you look at a report like this, in terms of the original behaviour and then the lies to try and excuse and divert and direct from it, he only really has himself to blame. If Boris Johnson had been whiter than white as he ought to, as part of the price of getting to run the country, by following everything that he and his own government had set out, and then if stuff had gone wrong, if he put his hands up to it, he wouldn't be in this position. But he is, and ultimately, a spiteful, angry tone to a report, as his allies are alleging, doesn't change the material that it found.
Yeah, but Mark, he says it was cock-up rather than conspiracy, doesn't he? And he says that this is all a vendetta.
Well, he says that it's a vendetta. There's a slight degree of, he would say that, wouldn't he, to quote someone else involved in a different scandal some decades ago. But the fact is that this report doesn't say mistakes were made. We've all heard 1,001 reports from different arms of the British state over the years. Says mistakes were made, lessons will be learned. It says that there were lies, and that is a fundamentally different thing. That's about knowing untruth, not mistakes of omission or just overlooking things. The fact is that everyone watching this show tonight will remember what those rules were like. We can remember their force and then the vital importance of them. We can remember when they got absurd, and things like the snacks and debates over the Scotch egg counted as a substantial meal in a pub and all that kind of stuff. The fact is that people around the country went through an awful lot in that dreadful period, and understandably they're furious when they find out people who were setting the rules, who were making rules, were breaking rules.
Yeah, Moya, we're looking ahead to Monday. There's going to be a vote in the House. The front page of the Metro, which seems to be on a run of good headlines at the moment, is proper whopper, a career stopper. What's your verdict on this whole affair? And do you think that Boris Johnson's political career is over now?
Well, I think good headlines are in the eye of the beholder. It definitely rhymes. I don't know if Boris Johnson's career is over. You'd think that something like this would be so big, so damning that no one can ever come back from it. But if you look at the history of British government, plenty of people have recovered their careers in some manner or other, whether that is within Parliament or without. You look at, say, the Chilcot inquiry. After that, you thought that Tony Blair and Alastair Campbell would probably never be on frontline politics again in the same manner, but they still have careers. Boris Johnson made over £1 million last year in speaking fees alone. He might not be back in the Commons as an MP, but that doesn't mean that he won't continue to profit from his long 18 years within Parliament, or whether he will still be involved in politics in some manner as a statesman who gives his opinions. I think that we have a very short-term memory when it comes to disgraced politicians in this country.
And Moya, what about the verdict of the committee, a 90-day suspension, if he'd still been an MP, of course, but he resigned. Do you think that is fair? Some are arguing it's perhaps overreaching.
Well, that 90-day suspension was actually imposed because of Boris Johnson's premature response to the committee's confidential letter that they sent him last week saying, look, this is what we've decided. It was going to be a 20-day suspension, but because Boris Johnson decided to jump the gun, resign, not take the suspension in case it triggered a by-election, you'd have to leave in what he saw as, I guess, a losing to the committee's rulings. Instead, he decided to jump before he was pushed. And because of that, and because of what he said in that letter that he released when he said he was resigning with immediate effect, they increased the suspension to 90 days. It's rather, bolting the barn door after the horse has already gone. But they gave very clear, articulate reasons for why they'd increased the suspension, because of this campaign that they called of abuse that they said Boris Johnson had been complicit in. And there also might be a follow-up report that is coming, this was threatened by the Privileges Committee, about that abuse and the campaigning on the behalf of Boris Johnson's allies that sought to undermine the credibility of the Privileges Committees and those that sat upon it, so that the verdict, when it was delivered on Boris Johnson, would not be taken as seriously and, as we've seen, would be surrounded by this miasma of conspiracy.
OK, well, let's have a look at the front page of the Daily Mail. We can imagine their take. The headline, Tory revolt over vindictive bid to banish Boris. Where does all this leave, Mark, the grassroots Conservatives, many of whom are still big fans of Boris Johnson, and indeed the public?
Well, I think it's possible to kind of over-egg the idea of there may well be a Tory revolt, as the Mail says. I'm sceptical that there'll be a civil war, as some commentators have been saying. I think if you see in parliamentary terms, I think Boris Johnson hasn't managed to hold together his support base on the Green benches in the House of Commons anywhere near as strongly as he might have liked. In the grassroots, he has from the evidence I've seen, a minority, but sizable minority of people who are still very enthusiastic about him, who are very annoyed about this. I've got to say, actually, touching on what Moya just said, this format of a committee investigating, a committee potentially a committee of other MPs deciding whether whether a punishment should pass a boundary that potentially triggers a by-election, I think is a less than ideal one. I think it does leave the road open for there to be dispute and allegations of personal bias and so on. Back in the coalition years, the Tories were elected in 2010 promising there would be what's called a recall power, the idea that voters would get to choose, if enough voters in a constituency in a short enough time signed a petition or similar, they'd be able to trigger a by-election. That was watered down with the Lib Dems in the coalition agreement, and the Conservatives agreed to water it down. Zach Goldsmith, actually a Boris Johnson ally, was the person proposing the kind of full-fat recall that would put this in the hand of voters. It was watered down that produced this committee fudge, and I think we can see that it's a less than ideal route because it crosses over whether people are being partisan or whether political or personal dislikes coming into it. That leaves it open, these kind of arguments. I'm also quite uncomfortable with the idea the committee should start disciplining people who criticise the committee. I think if you're going to have a system like this, you do need to stop somewhere. You can't have a kind of approach in which you start saying you should be punished for criticising the way in which the committee goes about things. we might like its conclusions or not, but parliamentarians should be free to decide that, and voters should decide who sits in Parliament.
Yeah, interesting point. And Moya, before we move on to our next story, our political editor Beth Rigby said tonight that the vote on Monday will be a litmus test, really, for Boris Johnson and his standing now. Would you agree with that?
I mean, obviously. I just want to come back on the point that Mark made. While I totally agree that there always should be more power put within the grassroots rather than just MPs, we should have a full functioning democracy. What's interesting about this committee and the, allegations that they say were abusive towards them is that throughout this process, Boris Johnson and his allies have been claiming that this is a kangaroo court. They said this is a witch hunt. They've been using all this very inflammatory language. 4 of the 7 MPs on that committee are Brexiteers. It is a Tory-laden committee. And it was one that was put together when Boris Johnson was still Prime Minister. He had the opportunity to whip the MPs to make sure that Harriet Harman, who has been the focus of a lot of these attacks and accusations of bias, was not the head of that committee. That didn't happen at the time. There's criticism, and there's what the allies of Boris Johnson and Boris Johnson have been doing, which is why it has led to this verdict that there's been a campaign to undermine the credibility of this committee. And I would say that has been accurate. What happens now and whether there should be further action taken, it seems a bit ridiculous if we get to the report on a report on a report about who did what. But there's no denying that there's been a concerted effort to make the committee look like it was biased in a way that it simply wasn't.
OK, listen, we're going to move on because we're heading towards the break, and I want to just touch on the front of The Guardian and this awful story today. It's on the right of the Guardian about this sinking of a migrant vessel. Mark feared that 500 hopes fade for 500 still feared missing. I mean, this is a real tragedy.
Absolutely horrendous news about which we're still learning yet more. As you say, that Guardian report covers a gentleman who's flown to Greece in search of his wife, who he believes was on this ship, and he is left with no news, no information, no clarity on what appears to be one of the worst maritime disasters of recent years. And again, it seems people being put in deadly peril and dying at the hands of completely ruthless people smuggling gangs.
Yeah, Moya, women and children as well believed to be on board.
Yeah, those early reports are saying that at least 100 children were in the hole. And what this will come down to, as we've seen time and time again, is also not just looking at the people smuggling gangs, but looking at the authorities that were involved or not involved in the rescue process. There's already been conflicting reports about authorities not coming to help when they were asked, and the authorities in Greece are saying no, that people refused help. What we've seen in the past with the disaster that happened in the Channel is there is a long-term back and forth before any families or victims or survivors get answers about what really happened. And that's going to be an even more torturous process for those who are left.
Yeah, just desperate, isn't it? OK, both, thank you for the moment. We'll speak again shortly. Coming up after the break, the Metro and other papers have the latest from Nottingham. A huge vigil was held this evening following the attacks which left 3 people dead. Discussing that and more in a moment. Hello, welcome back. Moya and Mark are still with us. Part 2 of the press preview. Moya, let's talk about events in Nottingham, because yet again today, close family members of those who died gave remarkable speeches. Their bravery in standing up and addressing the crowds was incredible, and actually also really unusual, isn't it, to see relatives going through this sort of trauma prepared to do something like this?
I would say in more recent years, I've remembered there have been a number of families who've made a point of standing up and saying, like Grace O'Malley Kumar's mother did, please don't have any hate in your hearts, which was a really key emotive line from this. I remember when the London Bridge attacks occurred, then we saw the family of the young man that was killed, Jack. They stood up and said something very, very similar and put out public statements. And I think it is a reflection of the current political climate we live in, and perhaps the speed at which information is circulated across social media. You get all these tidbits about the person who is alleged to have attacked these young people, and Ian Coates, who was also killed in Nottingham. And you get a lot of speculation immediately. None of this is helpful for families who are grieving, but also the pursuit of justice for their lost ones. And we have seen it more frequently. I was saying in recent years that families have come out and said, please don't jump to conclusions. Please don't say this. Please don't say that. Please don't have hate. That's not what our lost, loved ones believed in. And they made some absolutely devastating speeches. Barnaby Webber's mother talking about the fact that she didn't know what he was doing during history, perhaps because he wanted to be a pilot, and perhaps it was he wanted to fly Spitfires. It's those small little details that just really remind you of what is gone. It's tragic on every level. Yeah,
Mark, two youngsters clearly loving life, and a school caretaker who was described today as selfless.
Yes, two people at the very start of their lives now, adventures in the world, and one gentleman who so many tributes from the community that he was part of as to how much he had dedicated his life to helping people. And I've got to say, I'm in awe of families who at this moment of dreadful trauma can have the bravery and strength to speak out publicly in the way they did. God forbid, I doubt that I would have the strength to be able to do that in their circumstance. I do hope that we don't come to expect this as being a kind of thing which should automatically be expected of people. These evidently are families who've made an incredibly brave decision and have taken this moment to give a gift of their advice and their message to that community, which I think is hugely admirable.
Yeah, it really is. And let's finish with the front of the Daily Telegraph. More a fabulous picture there of Glenda Jackson, Oscar-winning actress, of course, former Labour MP. And it's been really interesting hearing today about her life and really being reminded of two fantastic careers.
Yeah, God, wasn't she a powerhouse? She won 2 Academy Awards, didn't bother going and picking up either of them. They ended up as bookends in her mother's house, she said. And she served 23 years as a Labour MP after she'd won Oscar, Tony, Emmy. And she was one of the most articulate performers that we had in the House of Commons. And it really shows in the tributes. You have papers like the Telegraph and the Daily Mail who would, you'd think normally would be opposed to someone like Glenda Jackson, who was a committed socialist. But no, they are staying there and they're paying tribute. I think that shows the absolute command and legacy that she has and the respect that she garnered for her long and illustrious career fighting for people's rights.
Yeah, and Mark, when we hear about MPs' egos, as we do quite a lot, she is one who appeared not to have an ego. She didn't even bother going to pick up her 2 Oscars.
And dare I say, you even hear that actors often have egos as well. But so she managed the double whammy of defying expectations on that front. But it's also a reminder about how important it is that we have people we should have people in Parliament, both Houses of Parliament, from a really wide range of perspectives and expertise. And it's totally valid for there to be young MPs as well as MPs who are late in their lives. I'm not someone who signs up so you must have done a certain number of decades of something else. But it's great to have Parliament leavened and improved by such a range of different backgrounds, and hers was one of the most unique. And she was the star of Morecambe and Wise, which we shouldn't forget. No,
it's been great watching that clip again today, hasn't it? Mark, Moya, thank you very much. Mark and Moya will be staying with us for the next hour to discuss tonight's news and tomorrow's headlines. Right now, let's take a look at the weather.